Hello guys, in this video we will implement this drawer animation in Ionic 6 and Angular, where basically the contents of the drawer animate in sync with the dragging, and this would be the end result. Now I've already created the design for our custom drawer here, but currently there is no animation, and we mainly want to animate three elements here: the avatar, active items background, which changes as we change the screen, and the menu icon. Now, if you want to learn how to implement the list animation that you just saw, do check out my other video where I've implemented this with explanation. So first thing first, to animate an element, we need a reference for that, and for that we need to give it an ID, which in our case is the avatar, which is this, active items background, which is this, and we'll cover the menu part later. So let's give the avatar an ID of user avatar. And for the background element, as you can see that we're iterating over a variable called app pages using ng4, and app pages here is the array of all the buttons, the drawer buttons that you see here with its name, icon, and path to the screens. So in order to get reference for the background element, we need to pass ID to this one where we're using ng4, and from there we can get reference for all the buttons and for their respective background elements. So let's give it an ID of drawer item list. Let's save it. Now we need to define them in the TypeScript file. For that we're going to use viewChild, pass the ID, and this is the basic syntax to define a reference in Angular. We're going to name it user avatar ref and with its type element ref. And for this one, as we're using ng4 to render the buttons, we're going to use something called viewChildren that will contain all the childs, which in this case is the buttons and their references, and from there we can get reference for the background element. So let's repeat the same, and we're going to name it drawer item list ref query list of type element ref, and let's save it. Now as you can see, there are a lot of variables here. This is the buttons array, drawer buttons array, this is the drawer's width, this is the width of the background, this is the active screen, and here we're doing some basic calculation for the drawer, calculating its width, calculating the background's width, and handling it for the split pen mode, which you would normally see on the bigger devices like the tablet, iPad, or on the browser. So in order to animate the elements as we drag it, we need some kind of reference event from the menu component. So let's look at the documentation, and it does provide some events, but they are mainly one-time events. So there is either called whenever we open the drawer or when we close the drawer. So there is no real-time callback for the drag progress. So how do we work around this? Now we can't possibly use our own gesture, because then that one will override the default one, and even if we use our own gesture, then we have to create our own drawer component, which would be very time consuming. So for that, let's look at the code for menu component in the official GitHub repository, and this is the code here. Let's look where they're handling the gesture, and that is here. And the main function that we need here is the onMove, which basically throw the event as the gesture is playing out. And inside this, as you can see, that it's doing some basic calculation to calculate the moving width with the drawer's width and updating the progress of the animation. And animation here is of course the default drawer animation. So let's look at where they're initializing this variable, which is inside the load animation function. And this load animation function is getting called in the _set open function, which is called whenever we open or close the drawer. using this should open variable. And inside the load animation, as you can see, that animation is only initialized the first time based on this condition. So to initialize this variable, it's using something called menu controller. So let's look at the code of menu controller, which is I have opened here. And there are a lot of variables here, and the main one that you need to know about is this register animation, which initialize the animation for the respective drawer type, which in our case is of course the reveal. And inside the function, it sets the animation for the drawer type inside a variable called menu animation, which is of type map. So it basically takes the drawer type as the key and the animation as the value. So, and the second function that we need is the underscore create animation, which is what we are calling here to get the animation for that particular drawer type. So it's basically getting the animation from this menu animation function for that particular drawer type, and that's what it is using, and updating its progress when we drag it on the onMove function. So what if we could find a way to pass our own type, own drawer type with our own animation, which would be of course the default drawer animation plus avatar and background elements animation, and then the rest of the things will work the same. So for that we need access to this register animation function, and we can get that from menu controller. Now Ionic does provide a service called menu controller, which we can import from here, but it doesn't provide access to this register animation function here. So, and if you look at the official documentation, there's nothing about this function here either. So turns out that we can import this menu component, menu controller, from a package called Ionic Core, which is also where the menu controller's code is. Now, I don't know why they don't have anything about this in their official documentation, and it took me a lot of Google searches to get an idea about this. And I also needed to explain all this because if I had imported this directly, you would think that where did this came from and why can't you find about this in the official doc? So from this menu control, we can get access to the register animation. So let's create a function here called init drawer animation, which we are going to call inside this ng after viewInit. Let's minimize this function for right now, and inside this function we're going to call our menu controller, and from there we can access the register animation. So this register animation basically takes two params. First one would be the drawer type, so we're going to name it my reveal because it's basically the same reveal drawer but with our animation. So, and the second param is it's passing some predefined animation as a function. So let's look at what it is inside the animation folder and inside the reveal.ts. Now, as you can see, there is some basic code for the animation of the drawer in case of reveal type, and it's doing some basic animation, translating X the view by the drawer's width, and that's it. Now, as we don't want to affect the default reveal animation, we're going to use the same here also. Let's now do some refactoring. We're gonna just call it reveal animation, and now we can import these also from Ionic Core, this one, and I guess we don't need to check here. And this base animation is basically some simple code where it's creating the animation and setting the duration based on the platform. So we don't really need this condition, so we can use this directly and set the duration same for all the platforms. And so we don't really need this mode here. We can remove this, and we also need to import this animation from here. Now let's use this function as the second param in the register animation. Let's save it. Now in order to make it work, we need to use our own defined drawer type, which is myReveal, and pass this as the type here. Now it's not working, so there is another thing that we need to add. And if you look at the code here, it's passing a class based on the type of the drawer, which in our case would be, of course, menu dash type dash reveal. Now as we are passing our own custom drawer type, it's not gonna be able to find a class for that. So and this is some predefined CSS styling or effect for that particular type. So to replicate that, we have to import this manually. So let's add the class menu type reveal, and it should work. So now our drawer is working exactly the same with our own type. So this part is done. The next step is to add our animation. So we're gonna first animate the avatar here. So let's create the animation for that. Let's create a variable avatar anim. Now we're gonna use the same create animation function here to create the animation for avatar. Create animation, add the element, which is of course this reference for the avatar, and this user avatar ref dot native element. And the another function is from to, where we specify the property that we want to animate. Now if you notice the animation, the avatar is rotating a little bit with a little scaling. So there are mainly two properties that we need to animate: the rotation and the scale. So for that, we're gonna define the property transform, where we can define both of these, rotation and the scaling. So the second param is the from value, the starting position. So we're gonna give it 36 degree, and the scale would be, let's give it 0.8. And start in the sense that when the drawer is closed, so what would be its starting position when the drawer is closed in this case, and the end position would be when the drawer is completely opened. So the third param is the end position, which would of course its original position, so that would be rotate 0 degree and scale 1. Now we need to pass this inside this function so that we can add the animation here. And for that, let's give another param here, and we're gonna give a array of animation type, because we're also gonna pass the animation for the background element. So we're going to give it a type of array of animation and pass this using the same add animation function. We can also pass the array of animation. So let's pass it here and let's break it and return the function here. Now we get an idea about this, that we get access to menu variable inside this function. So we're going to pass this here. And the second param would be the array, where we're going to pass the avatar animation. Now let's save it and our animation should work. Let's see. And it is working. So our animation for the avatar is complete. So the next step now is to animate the background, and for that we need to animate every item's background, because every item has a background. It's just that it's showing only in case it is active, and on the other case it would be transparent. So we're gonna have to animate all of them. So for that, as we're using view children here, so we need to add the animation for all of them, and for that we're gonna convert this into an array. So let's define a variable called itemRef array. This dot draw item list ref and convert this into an array. Now we need to loop over it using for off loop. You can now name it itemRef. Use this and get the element from this itemRef dot native element. Now the element here is of course the reference for all the buttons here, and from there we can get reference for their respective background element. So, and to get, now this is the reference of this one, and to get reference for this background element we need to use a function called query selector, which we can get inside this. And in query selector we need to pass the class of the element, which is this, which is for background element is drawer inner item. So let's create the animation for the buttons, and we're gonna name it drawer item anim. Let's create the animation using create animation function. Add the element, which would be this. Now this is the reference for this one, and to access this background element, because we're gonna animate that one, and for that we're gonna use something called query selector and pass the class of the element, which is of course this drawer inner item. And the third function is from to, where we specify the property that we want to animate. So in case of background element, as you can see that we're translating this background view by a particular distance. So the property here would be transform, and the starting position, which of course when the drawer is closed. So we want the background to start from here and end here. So the starting position would be translate x, and as we know the width of this background element, we're gonna give it a starting position of minus row width pixel, and we have to convert this. We're gonna use this one here, and the end position would be of course translate x 0 pixel, which is of course this its original position when the drawer is completely opened. we're gonna use this row with here, and now let's create an array where we will store all of these animation for every item, every button here. So let's give it a name of drawer items of type animation array, type array, default empty array, and let's pass this animation inside this variable. Now we can pass this in this reveal animation function, and for that we're going to use sprite operator and pass all these animations. Now it should work as the avatar animation works, so let's check. And animation for the background element is also working. So it's basically, when it's close, it's starting from the minus row width, which is the width of the background element. So it will start from this position and slowly move to its end position, which is when the drawer is completely open, which is the 0 pixel. So animation for the background background element and the avatar element is complete. Now if here, as you can see, that we're using the default reveal animation, and if you want you can customize this as you want, but I'm using the same default animation here. So you can customize this, change the duration and all that. It's totally up to you. So animation is complete, and now this is a simple code, and the only complex thing that I think was to decide which method to use, and for that we needed to dig a little into the Ionic code. Now let's also check this on Android. So for that we're gonna run Ionic capacitor run Android to make sure that our code is working perfectly on Android and iOS, both the platforms. And it's working also perfectly on Android. So our animation is working perfectly on both Android and iOS. So the next part of this is to animate the menu icon transition animation, where the menu icon translates to back icon as we drag the drawer. So as the video is getting a little longer, we're gonna cover this in the next video. So I hope you like the video, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.